Colonial Williamsburg. The name itself evokes an image of idyllic American origins, a charming, orderly town where the ideals of liberty, democracy, and self-government were carefully nurtured by bewigged patriots. It is presented to us as a living museum, a perfectly preserved cradle of the American Revolution. But what if this picture-perfect town is a carefully constructed dream, built on the foundations of a much more complex, chaotic, and contradictory reality? What secrets are hidden just beneath these cobblestones? This is the story of Colonial Williamsburg you may not know. It's a story that reveals this place was not just a cradle of liberty, but a crucible where the defining elements of America, freedom and slavery, order and rebellion, aspiration and exploitation, were forged in conflict. To understand Williamsburg, we must first journey a few miles downriver to the ghost of a settlement that preceded it, a place of fire, swamp, and starvation. Before Williamsburg, there was Jamestown. Founded in 1607, it was the first permanent English settlement in North America, and for its first decades, it was a catalog of horrors. The colonists were plagued by a toxic water supply, a brackish mix of salt and fresh water laced with arsenic and fecal contamination that bred disease. They faced constant threats from the Powhatan warriors whose lands they had occupied, and they were perpetually starving. The winter of 1609 to 1610 became known as the Starving Time. Trapped inside their fort by a Powhatan siege, the population dwindled from over 300 to just 60 emaciated survivors. They ate their horses, then their dogs, cats, rats, and even the leather from their shoes. For centuries, these were just stories, grim accounts from survivors. Then, in 2012, archaeology provided the horrifying proof. In a 17th-century trash pit, scientists unearthed the partial remains of a 14-year-old English girl whom they named Jane. Forensic analysis of her skull and shin bone revealed unmistakable, systematic chop and cut marks. It was the first, undeniable scientific evidence of survival cannibalism in colonial America. Jane had been butchered for her meat. Jamestown was a place of profound failure. Its state house, the very seat of government, burned to the ground 4 separate times. The final fire, in 1698, was the last straw. Virginia's leaders decided they needed a fresh start, a new capital, built not on a foundation of misery and chaos, but one of order and reason. In 1699, the capital was officially moved 5 miles inland to a settlement called Middle Plantation, strategically located on higher ground between the James and York rivers. It was renamed Williamsburg in honor of William III, and was conceived as one of America's first planned cities. This new city was a direct and conscious repudiation of the Jamestown experience. The chaos, disease, and desperation of the first settlement created a powerful psychological need among Virginia's leaders to impose a rigid, rational, and visible order on their new capital. Governor Francis Nicholson, who had experience designing the new capital of Annapolis in Maryland, oversaw a layout that was the very antithesis of Jamestown's organic disarray. The city's design was a physical manifestation of Enlightenment ideals. A grand 99-foot-wide thoroughfare, the Duke of Gloucester Street, was laid out to connect the 2 new poles of colonial power. At one end stood the College of William and Mary, founded in 1693, representing knowledge, faith, and the future. At the other end rose the magnificent new Capitol, completed in 1705, a symbol of law, order, and political authority. This was more than city planning. It was an attempt to engineer a successful society from the ground up, a society that would leave the ghost of Jamestown buried in the swamp. This new orderly capital quickly became the vibrant economic and cultural heart of Virginia. Its streets buzzed with the activity of dozens of skilled artisans. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons essential for the colony's survival and expansion. Joiners and cabinet makers crafted everything from the window frames of buildings to the luxury furniture that filled them. Coopers built the barrels essential for shipping Virginia's goods, while tailors, milliners, and wig makers clothed its citizens in the latest English fashions. The city even had the first permanent playhouse in the American colonies, where touring companies performed for the gentry, bringing a piece of London's cultural life to the Virginia frontier. But this thriving world of commerce and culture, this well-ordered city, was built on a brutal and contradictory foundation. The engine that drove Williamsburg's prosperity and elegance was human bondage. By the time of the American Revolution, a stark and often ignored fact defined the city. More than half of its population was black and enslaved. This system was codified over time. The first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, initially held in a status closer to indentured servitude, but by 1705, Virginia's laws had formalized a system of race-based, lifelong, and hereditary slavery.
The prosperity and sophistication of Williamsburg were not merely supported by this system, they were structurally dependent on it. The very symbols of the city's elegance were products of enslaved labor. The magnificent gardens of the governor's palace were designed, dug, and maintained by skilled enslaved gardeners. The grand households and bustling taverns that hosted the colony's elite were run by enslaved cooks, butlers, and maids. Even the Capitol building, the seat of Virginia's liberty-minded assembly, was partially funded by a tax on the importation of enslaved people, and enslaved men were purchased by the government to work on its construction. Yet, within this system of oppression, enslaved individuals carved out lives of meaning, dignity, and resistance. In the taverns of Williamsburg, an enslaved man named Gowan Pamphlet risked severe punishment to preach the Baptist faith to secret congregations of other enslaved people. He would go on to found what is now the First Baptist Church of Williamsburg, and remarkably, gain his freedom. The story of John Harris, an enslaved man who served one of Virginia's most powerful politicians, Peyton Randolph, comes to us through a 1775 runaway advertisement. The ad describes him in detail, from the fine livery uniform he escaped in to his alleged addiction to alcohol, a detail that may hint at a form of personal defiance or simply be a master's attempt to discredit him. His escape was a courageous bid for the freedom his enslaver was simultaneously demanding from Britain. Perhaps the most profound story of unintended consequences comes from the Williamsburg Bray School. Founded in 1760, this institution was dedicated to educating free and enslaved black children. Its purpose, however, was not liberation. The school's Anglican founders aimed to teach literacy for the sole purpose of reading the Bible, hoping to instill a version of Christianity that taught obedience and acceptance of one's enslaved status as being divinely ordained. But the act of providing the tools of education, even for the purpose of control, proved to be inherently unstable. The skills learned within the Bray School's walls could also be used to subvert the system that created it. We know of at least one student, a young man named Isaac B., who used the literacy he gained at the school to forge a pass and escape to freedom. The very tool meant to ensure his bondage became his key to liberation. As the capital of Britain's largest and most influential American colony, Williamsburg was the political epicenter of the growing revolutionary movement. Within the walls of the capital, the House of Burgesses, a representative assembly with roots stretching back to 1619 in Jamestown, debated the very meaning of liberty. It was here, in 1765, that a young burgess named Patrick Henry delivered his incendiary speech against the Stamp Act. Likening King George III to tyrants of the past, he was met with cries of treason from the chamber floor. His defiant response, "If this be treason, make the most of it," sent shockwaves through the colonies. Young men like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, both serving as burgesses, witnessed these debates firsthand, honing the political and philosophical arguments they would later use to found a nation. The physical and social layout of Williamsburg created a unique political ecosystem. The close proximity of the capital, the college, and the taverns meant that when the doors of official power were slammed shut, the revolution simply moved down the street. In 1769, and again in 1774, when the royal governor dissolved the House of Burgesses for its rebellious acts, the members simply walked down the Duke of Gloucester Street, reconvened in the Apollo Room of the Raleigh Tavern, and continued their work as an extra-legal body. It was in this tavern, not the capital, that they passed a resolution to boycott British goods, and most critically, issued the 1774 call for a Continental Congress, uniting the colonies in a common cause. The final collapse of British authority in Virginia came in the spring of 1775. Fearing an armed uprising, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, ordered British Marines to seize the colony's gunpowder from the Williamsburg magazine in the dead of night. The act was seen as a profound betrayal, confirming the colonists' worst fears of British tyranny. Faced with the threat of armed militias marching on the capital, Governor Dunmore fled the governor's palace in June 1775, taking refuge on a British warship. His flight effectively ended more than 160 years of royal government in Virginia. From the safety of the sea, he issued Dunmore's Proclamation, a desperate gamble offering freedom to any enslaved man who would abandon his patriot master and fight for the king, a move that further enraged the colonists and turned the political conflict into an all-out war. This revolutionary moment was not shaped by a few famous men alone. The Crucible of Williamsburg involved a diverse cast of characters, each pursuing their own vision of freedom. While patriot leaders like Jefferson and Henry debated natural rights in the capital, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, wielded the promise of emancipation as a weapon of war. At the same time, enslaved individuals like Gowan Pamphlet sought spiritual freedom by founding a church, and James Armistead Lafayette risked his life as a spy for the Continental Army to win his personal liberty. And in the middle of it all were people like Anne Wager, a white teacher carrying out a complex mission of education and control. All of these lives, intersecting in this one small city, tell the true, complicated story of the American Revolution. In 1780, the capital of Virginia was moved to Richmond, seeking a more central and secure location. Williamsburg reverted to a quiet college town and rural county seat. This economic stagnation, however, proved to be its salvation. With no financial pressure to modernize, many of its 18th-century buildings simply survived, neglected but intact. In 1926, that quiet survival caught the eye of two men with a grand vision: the Reverend Dr. W.A.R. Goodwin, rector of Williamsburg's Bruton Parish Church, and the wealthy philanthropist John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Together, they launched one of the most ambitious historic preservation projects in history. This was not a simple touch-up. It was a full-scale remaking of a city. The project ultimately encompassed 85% of the original colonial town. 89 original 18th-century structures were painstakingly restored, while hundreds more were reconstructed on their original foundations. To achieve this vision of the past, over 700 buildings that were deemed modern were demolished. This massive undertaking was more than an architectural project. It was an act of myth-making. Rockefeller and Goodwin sought to create a shrine of history and beauty, a physical embodiment of an idealized American origin story. At a time of national crisis during the Great Depression, and later ideological conflict during the Cold War, the restored Williamsburg was intended to be a source of healthful information, an inspiration reminding Americans of the democratic ideals of their nation builders. The history presented at Colonial Williamsburg has served as a powerful mirror reflecting America's own evolving and often painful conversation about its past. For its first few decades, the narrative focused almost exclusively on the lives of rich white patriots. The institution of slavery, which involved more than half the town's population, was largely ignored or sanitized, with enslaved people referred to simply as servants. That began to change in 1979, when Colonial Williamsburg became one of the first major American museums to incorporate African American history into its daily programming. This shift, influenced by the civil rights movement and a new generation of historians, was groundbreaking, but also fraught with controversy. A 1994 reenactment of a slave auction was so emotionally powerful and contentious that it was never repeated. Black interpreters have faced racist comments from visitors, a painful reminder of the enduring legacy of the history they portray.
The evolution from ignoring slavery to confronting its brutal reality mirrors the nation's own difficult journey. The story of Colonial Williamsburg is therefore not just a story of the 18th century, but a story of how Americans in the 20th and 21st centuries have chosen to remember their origins. The true significance of Colonial Williamsburg, then, lies not in its polished perfection, but in its profound contradictions. It was a place where the highest ideals of liberty were debated by men who held others in bondage. It was a meticulously planned city built on a brutal economic system. It was a revolutionary capital that became a sleepy town, only to be reborn as a national symbol, its story changing as the nation itself changed. To visit Colonial Williamsburg today is not to step into a sanitized past. It is to engage with the messy, complicated, and powerful crucible where the United States was forged. It is a place to confront the paradoxes that still shape our world, and to truly understand the enduring mission that the future may learn from the past.